Hello, my name is Thamara Faustine and I'm going to present you a brief explanation about the history of English literature. So let's get started. The four topics that will be explained are the Old English that are often called as the Anglo-Saxon era, then the medieval or Middle Ages. Next is the Renaissance era, and the last is the Restoration and Revolution era. So let's move on to the first topic. That is the Anglo-Saxon that occurred in the 410 when the Romans left Britain. And in the year 450, a lot of Germanic tribes came in just like the English and the Saxon, and they brought a new language that called as Old English. And their culture became the basis of English culture. So in their culture, they will meet for the main hall for daily meals, storytelling, and parties. They believe that God and also the evil. They follow the pattern like the god at the top, and then the kings, then the warrior, and the lowest is the slaves. Their religion was the mix of pagan and Christian value. Then came the Viking in the year 790s and destroyed a lot of things in England. They were the reason why there is only one story left from the Anglo-Saxon time period because they destroyed all of the other works. Then they defeated in the hands of the powerful Anglo-Saxon king, King Alfred. Unfortunately, in the year 1066, Alfred the Great's successor, Harlord, who was the final crowned king of England for Anglo-Saxon time period, was defeated by the William and the Conqueror and his Norman army. The Norman conquest ended the Anglo-Saxon rule in England. So, what are the characteristics of the work in this era? So, the literature took from the lengthy epic poems that praised the epic hero. The character was somebody that is larger than life, that have traits that reflect ideals of society, performs courageous, superhuman deeds, and he was fighting in brutal condition not only to human but also to the dragon monster, and it tells about obtaining glory. The epic poems were far more than simple entertainment. There were also a lesson and moral sermon. And the only example from this era is only the Beowulf. The Beowulf probably written in the year 750 while the author is unknown. Although it was written in England, the poem described events that take place in the Scandinavia around the 500s. It took place in Denmark and Sweden about the hero named Beowulf. Then let's go to the second topic, that is the Middle Ages or the medieval era. It occurred in the 1066 when the Normans came. They spoke the rural dialect of French with considerable Germanic influences. Anglo-Norman French became the language of the king and nobility of England for more than 300 years. The mixture of Old English and Anglo-Norman, called as the Middle English. The history can be divided into three stages, that is the High Middle Ages, that the literature was written in Latin, then the Middle Ages Plain, which developed during the 11th and 13th centuries when the Romans and Anglo-Saxon language developed, epic, and poetry with narration of heroic and amorous events. Then the Late Middle Ages or the Pre-Renaissance, where the great social changes took place. In the field of literature, the knightly novel and Provence theatre were born. Medieval English literature was characterized by works that mostly by unknown authors, with topics related to the moral and religion, chivalry stories, religious texts, Arthurian, and was written in Latin because at the time still heavily influenced by Latin and French. The other characteristic of the work, the first is the epic. It is a famous characteristic used to speak about the adventure of people and the heroic situation in which they were involved. Mainly they have happy ending about the hero who had to fight something evil and they won. Then the second is love. The story of knight who could face a dragon to save his beloved woman. So it is the mix between the epic and the love. The rarity because the reading and writing were rare, and the literary works were transmitted through story and song. Anonymity and imitation because the author at the time used to acknowledge author before them and sometimes imitate their works, that mostly about the epic. So to avoid the censorship, it was written under anonymity. And the last is the work by female author. So the female or mostly the nun in this era wrote books, for example the Nun of Sweden, which the nun was telling about the vision that she had, which consists of Saint Jesus and Virgin Mary. And one of the example of this era came from Geoffrey Chaucer. He is considered to be the father of English poetry because he wrote in English rather in French or Latin. His Canterbury Tales records the imagined conversation of pilgrims as they journeyed from London to Canterbury. Other works are also important because they push English beyond the French and Latin, that English became the dominant language which developed into English that we speak today. And we come to the third topic. It is about the Renaissance era. This is the era where the artistic, social, scientific, and political thought turned into a new direction. So what happened in this era? The Renaissance in England culminated during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Then the Reformation of the Church happened in England from Catholic to Protestant. The English Renaissance occurred from 1500 until 1688. The characteristic was the idea of divine right of the kings to rule. Development of humanistic ideas, such as the dignity of the man. It was a time of scientific inquiry and exploration, and the time of the Protestant Reformation. People began to question the power of church leader, and they began to focus life on earth. And the invention and spreading of the printing press. In this era, social and cultural life was centered around London and the royal court, and going to the theater was a popular entertainment for all social classes in this era. Then the characteristic of work in this era are the writers of the period not only wanted to imitate art, but they hoped to change the reality through art. The writers reflected a spirit of exploration that was going on throughout the world, and they believed in the art of imitation, gravitating toward the Greek and Roman writer and writing styles. The second is reforms in the institution because institutions were questioned and re-evaluated. The third is humanist awakening by Utopia. Sir Thomas More Utopia, which translates as No Place in Greek, was published in the 1516. Utopia portrays an ideal society where people live in peace and harmony. Next is the dominance of reason. So reason dominated all the spheres of life, that decreased the influence of religion on people. And the last is the work of the playwrights and poets circulated in manuscript form for some time before they were published. And above all of the play of English and Renaissance theater were the outstanding legacy of that period. And one of the examples of works in this era came from William Shakespeare, the world's greatest playwright. He wrote historical plays about the King of England, comedies, tragedies like Romeo and Juliet. Who didn't know Romeo and Juliet, right? As well as love poetry in the form of the sonnets. Many well-known English sayings came from the Shakespeare world, and he has a great influence of the English literature. So we come to the last topic of today's videos, that is the Restoration and Revolution era. So this era happened because of the monarchy was restored in the 1660 to around 1688 after the Commonwealth of England as Charles II returned from the exile in France. Charles II then brought a new era both in life and literature. This era, also known as the neoclassical period, which one of its characteristics is observing human nature and the nature itself, which considered unchanging as constant. So the characteristics of the era are the social and political conflict. With the comeback of the Charles II, England's social, political, and religious tenets have transformed. The opening of theaters, so all the institutions that were closed in the puritanical movement were opened during the Restoration period. The rise of neoclassicism. The literature took a new spirit and outlook and a different attitude in the subject and style. As Edward Albert say, the post-Restoration period is often set up as converge and antithesis of the previous Elizabethan age. It is called classical as opposed to the Elizabethan Romanticism. Then the imitation of the ancient. The author directed their attention to the slavish imitation of rule and ignored the importance of the subject matter. This habit was noticeable in the age of Dryden and was strengthened in the age of Pope. Then the realism and the new literary forms. So the practice of realism in this period is against the Elizabethan romantic ideal, and the writer sought to paint realistic picture of a corrupt court and society and emphasize on vices rather than virtues. Some important literary forms are as under the satire, poetry, drama, and heroic couplet. After the Charles II died in the 1688, James II took over the throne, and later William III removed James in 1688, and this considered as a mark of the end of the Restoration period and often referred to the Glorious Revolution. So the literature in this era took a new spirit outlook and a different attitude in subject and style. It attempts to come to terms with the political events that had occurred in the previous decades. The early Restoration written sought to paint realistic picture of the corrupt court and society, emphasized vices rather than virtues. It against the Elizabethan romantic ideals. Some of the literary forms are under the satire, poetry, drama, and heroic couplet. There are political, philosophical, new social and economic concepts that are used in these literary works and drama. So the other characteristics are the rise of the neoclassicism, then the imitation of the ancient, then the realism because the literary work is concerned with the life and being realistic. The satire was the most popular literary tool that is used by many authors in this era because they are use this to acknowledge a problem in society and educate the public through the literature, while the playwrights use satire to expose and critique social injustice. The poetry, the poet completely discarded the romanticism of Elizabethan poetry and rejected the moral of the Puritan poets. The drama. The theatre were opened during this era, which it gave rise to the development of the comedy of manners, which portrayed the sophisticated life of the dominant class of society. Then the heroic couplet. The literature in this era adopted the heroic couplet as a poetic medium, that is two iambic pentameter lines which rhyme together. Waller, who began to use it in the 1623, is generally regarded as the father of the couplet. Later, Waller and Dryden made the couplet a literary fashion. So the example and the author of the works is John Milton. He is one of the greatest poets and is celebrated for his powerful rhetoric poetry and is famous mainly for his epic poems. the Paradise Lost. Besides poems, Milton published pamphlets defending civil and religious rights. So that's all for today's video about the history of English literature, and I'm Thamara Faustine. Thank you for your attention and have a good day.